The Resident Evil franchise has become one of gaming's most iconic and recognizable names, with a legacy spread across several decades and spanning multiple sequels and spin-offs. And along the way, those experiments and those games have created some of the most memorable soundtracks ever. And in this video we're going to be discussing what makes a Resident Evil soundtrack sound Resident Evil. So, let's get into it. Let's first try to define what makes Resident Evil be Resident Evil. The first thing that comes to mind is of course the horror elements, body horror in general, because we're talking about a zombie apocalypse induced by a virus. So plenty of horrific mutations are going to be part of the menu. Then we also have plenty of action, particularly on later games, giving this sense of intensity and dynamism. But also you got plenty of exploration and puzzle solving. So all of those elements are very important to keep in mind when analyzing the soundtrack for a game like this, or a game series like this, which also happens to have evolved quite a lot throughout time. We'll be discussing how the first batch of games, the classic games that I like to call, started from Resident Evil 1 all the way down to 3 and called Veronica, have a particular style, or the approach behind the songwriting and the use of sound effects is very different from what happens after the release of Resident Evil 4, which from there onwards the series became very much action-packed, very much driven by the action and the gunplay. And also we'll be discussing what happened after the release of Resident Evil 7, because the game mechanics changed dramatically again, bringing a little bit of elements from classic 80s movies such as the Chainsaw Massacre, and also by the time we reached Resident Evil Village, even adding a little bit of the Hammer horror films from the golden age of cinema, because you got vampires, werewolves and stuff. So let's get into it. So most of the soundtracks for the franchise are based on sound design. Why? Because the goal of the player is to explore the environments and find a way to survive the horror that is the whole zombie apocalypse around you. Ammo tends to be quite scarce, at least in the classic games, forcing the player to be very resourceful and also intelligent in the way that the player manages his way across the different environments and how to dodge or engage in combat with the different enemies presented to you. Then the puzzle-solving element is it's been a very integral part of the franchise, giving a little bit of a break of the pacing, because it's very stressful. I gotta tell you, if you haven't played those games, I totally recommend them. But they tend to be very stressful on the player because you're always on the edge of your seat. At least the first time you play the game, when you don't know the mechanics that well, and you don't know how to exploit them. Later on, if you know what I mean, you know what I mean. So the sound design is reflective of those moments. Also, the music tends to be quite, not necessarily speaking present for the vast majority of cases. It's much more ambient-like driven, but there are points in which it makes itself almost like the protagonist of the scene or the section of the game that you are going through at that point. Very clever. The thing is that also Resident Evil has plenty of campiness to it, and its action and the characters and even the situations are super larger than life, even though everything around you kind of have this grounded feel. In a way, I think it's a very quintessential Japanese thing. I don't know how to describe it. Tell me what you think about that in the comments. So with that in mind, let's begin with the first game of the series, and it's the first one that I actually played, Resident Evil Remake. I got into Resident Evil when I was a kid, when I finally got myself a copy of the fantastic remake, produced and developed by Capcom and released on the GameCube back in the early 2000s. And I got my head blown off by the sheer amount of fun, excitement, the thrill of exploring the passages and the hallways of that kind of spooky haunted mansion, while always running low in resources and trying to, survive the whole environment. It was a unique experience that truly changed the way that I saw video games back in the day. One of the things that actually took me by surprise, and probably is I have always been quite musical inclined ever since I was a kid, was the incredible use of sound effects and also the lack of music, because the game is, even though it has plenty of soundscapes, is not necessarily driven by music itself. Why am I saying that? It all comes down to the gameplay, because the idea of the game is for you to survive and explore the incredible maze-like environments that are part of the mansion, and then the lab that are part of the whole map that you explore as a survivor in the game. The sound design is created in a way that always keeps you at the very edge of your seat, Always expecting not a jump scare, but an actual threat that could finish off that run. And since ammo is very scarce in the game, and also saving your progress is based on particular points across the game that also involve the use of resource management, because it's not that you can simply step into one of those save rooms and save your game there. No, you gotta actually be quite mindful of how many ink ribbons you still have left in your inventory, forcing you to be very conscious in the way and the moments on which you're saving your progress. With that in mind, the sound design reflects that beautifully. But not because most of the soundtrack is based on soundscapes, it doesn't mean that there is not good music in there. On the contrary, for example, one of my favorite tracks is the one that comes out of the save rooms. Conveying this kind of feeling of you being in some form of a safe haven, for lack of a better term, like an oasis of some sort, amidst the horrible nightmare that is surrounding you, giving you this sense of not safety, because you feel the sadness and also the dread that is still around you, while also conveying this sense of introspection and inner reflection, don't you think? After playing the remake, I had the chance to play the other games in the series, and I love them, particularly for obvious reasons. Resident Evil 2 is considered by many the best of the classic style Resident Evil games, and that one got a very, I gotta say, magnificent remake released a few years ago, and I've been playing that bad boy for the last few days, and actually that's the inspiration behind this video. And I realized that the soundtrack for the remake, it's slightly more action-driven. Why? Because the gameplay in the remake is a little bit more is faster. They removed the tank controls that made those old style, classic style Resident Evil games out of the equation, and inserted a mechanic that is very similar to the ones that you find in Resident Evil 4. More on that later. And this is very important because Resident Evil games, even though they are based on the whole concept of horror, I never found it to be horrific or kinda spooky, to be very frank with you. Because if I have a way to describe them, is tense and kinda stressful. Because due to the whole survival element that is very present in the classic games, and also the action on the much more modern takes is still based on resource management, not just gunplay. And the music is very reflective of it, particularly these tracks from the remake. Check it out. Now moving over to Resident Evil 4, one of my favorite games ever, which I also played back in the day when it was an exclusive for the GameCube. And this game truly took me by surprise. It's amazing, fun, fast-paced, full of one-liners. I love the fact that it comes with ballistics. Everything about it is just amazing. And the sound design is incredible as well, because the sound of the guns is punchy, it's very dynamic, and also the ambience and the soundscapes that you hear across the entirety of the soundtrack are very well done. And instead of taking this creepy approach, since this is a very action-oriented game, and your character and the amount of abilities that you have as a player on the game, well, the sound design is there to make you feel like the badass that Leon S. Kennedy is. And it truly reflects on it. The music has much more music, is much more in your face, also is much more present across the game, and it's very inspired by some of those old movies from the 80s. What's not to love about this game? It's fantastic. And the remake is even better. Gameplay mechanics are expanded, are very good, and also the sound design is great, particularly in the Separate Ways DLC content, in which you play as the super spy Ada Wong. And the music is very reflective of that. It kinda has a very interesting mix between the soundtracks from the James Bond movies and a little bit of the Mission Impossible stuff as well, creating this very unique Resident Evil sounding soundtrack that is amazing. A perfect fit for this particular game. And when it comes to Resident Evil 4, of course, there are plenty of beautiful musical cues reminiscent to that tradition that comes from the save rooms from the previous games. And the thing is that the remake and the original soundtrack have completely different tracks when it comes to those moments. So I'm gonna show you the two of them and tell me which one is your favorite. Now let's discuss the current era of Resident Evil games that got started with the release of Resident Evil 7. This game marked a completely different approach in the way that the games were designed, because now we're dealing with a first-person perspective, and also they scaled down dramatically the amount of action on screen. Heavily inspired by classic horror movies, as I mentioned before, such as the Chainsaw Massacre, the change of perspective also had a huge impact in the way the music and the soundtracks were created. Because now, instead of you being able to see the reactions of your character on screen, you being in a first-person perspective creates a much more visceral and much more personal reaction to the action taking place on screen. So the sound design is even more atmospheric, tends to be a little bit even less in the way than before, but one thing is still present. When the action kicks in, you start to hear this kind of semi-orchestral, very cinematic, but not as big as a Hans Zimmer soundtrack tends to be, for example, approach to the development of the music that actually somehow balances the creepiness, but at the same time kind of removes a little bit of it, don't you think? Because I love, for example, on Resident Evil Village, one particular section in which, without trying to go down with the spoilers, you lose all access to all of your weapons, and you are basically defenseless, and you are trying to survive your way around a kind of spooky house in which you're followed by a very grotesque thing. I'm not gonna spoil anything because that's my favorite part of that game, and the soundtrack in that particular section is amazing. It fits perfectly with what you see, with what you are actually interacting with, and being followed by that monstrosity, and also trying to escape and hide using your surroundings, and even using the sound cues. It's such a great, fun experience that I don't want to spoil it. And for real, if you like to play video games, that section alone justifies the price of admission. So there you got it. What do you think? Resident Evil is a franchise that, as I said before, has plenty of ups and downs, but in general has been fantastic. And I only focus my attention on the games because there are plenty of the live-action movies that are completely a different beast, and just trying to be kind to them. And also those animated films that I haven't watched, being frank, but from what I have seen, they took everything about the action and the larger-than-life characteristics of the characters of the game, and they cranked them up to 11. They seem to be fun, so if you happen to have watched those movies, tell me if they are worth my time, and please recommend me which one to start with. With that being said, thank you very much, thank you for watching, thank you for joining, and as with every single time that I meet you, I gotta remind you that you should never let anybody tell you what to dream about, and remember that I will see you when I see you.